You are watching Macro TV. We are busy with the basic model of the macroeconomy in Study Unit 2, Chapter 3 of Fourie and Burger. This is video number 6 out of 10 covering content from Chapter 3. Now, we talked about linking the monetary and the real sectors, and we had a little example of a change in monetary policy and how that feeds through from the monetary sector to the real sector through interest rates and investment. I briefly introduced what would happen if there's a change in government spending, and we talked about the crowding out effect. Now we'll go into it in a bit more detail. Now, this graph starts from an increase in government spending. That's over here in the real sector. G increases from G0 to the level G1. So that's typically expansionary monetary policy taking place with the view to help the economy to grow. Now, what happens is that this increase in spending pushes up the aggregate spending line to a new equilibrium over there, and you can see output or incomes increasing along the longer of the arrows over here. Now, typically what happens is that such an increase in incomes causes an increase in the demand for money. So the demand for money moves to the right. Now, to reach equilibrium again with the supply of money, that means that interest rates have to increase. So interest rates go up. When interest rates go up, investment declines. So there's a decline in investment. And this decline in investment then moves aggregate spending down again to a new equilibrium at this level over here. So there's an initial expansionary effect due to the increase in government spending, but then there's a contraction due to the decrease in investment. The net effect on income is positive, and there is an increase in income due to this initial increase in government spending. The key thing to realize that there's a primary effect and then a second round or secondary effect that you need to take account of now that we have linked the real sector with the monetary sector. Now, what happens with that sort of decline in investment leading to a contraction in income, that's called crowding out. So the increase in government spending in the end causes private investment to decrease a bit. The private sector is crowded out by government spending in the economy. Now, these two effects happen simultaneously, but we split them up into a primary and a secondary to make it easier to talk through what happens. So you can't talk about everything happening at the same time. So the secondary effect would be valid for any kind of stimulation of the GDP. So if there's an exogenous increase in exports, all of a sudden the world economy starts growing and South African exports just boom, it would have a similar story that it influences the South African economy through interest rates and investment. So if there's any autonomous increase in investment even, investment changes due to monetary policy pressure, if there's a change in consumption due to a change in income tax, there would be the secondary effect that you need to take account of. Now, how strong is fiscal policy and how strong is this crowding out effect? It depends on a number of parameters that you need to take account of. Typically, by how much does the demand for money change due to a change in income? So that's a good question to answer. So if incomes go up, it causes a change in or an increase in the demand for money, which causes a change in interest rates. You need to know how big is that increase in the demand for money. Similarly, if the demand for money changes, how big is the interest rate response that we get from that? We know that if the demand for money increases, interest rates go up, but by how much? And then, we've talked about this one already, if interest rates change, by how much does investment change? How sensitive is investment to a change in interest rates? And then the good old expenditure multiplier comes into it again as well. Now there's a change in investment. How big is that impact on output/incomes? In a way, the financing of the budget deficit also influences the the effect that fiscal policy can have when government uses either expansionary or contractionary policy. Let's say that it's expansionary policy. In other words, government spending is greater than taxation. Now, the only way that government can do this is then they run a deficit, which then needs to be financed in some way. They can borrow within South Africa domestically from the private non-bank sector. That would just mean selling government bonds and treasury bills to large corporations. That sort of leads to an increase in the demand for money by the government. So money demand increases. That pushes up interest rates. It reduces investment, and then output decreases. That typically happens in the second round. An alternative would be to borrow the money from the Reserve Bank. Now, typically this is seen as similar to printing money. When the government sells their treasury bonds or government debt to the Reserve Bank, that's an inflow from money that didn't used to be part of the circular flow of spending and income. So when this money sort of comes into the economy, the money supply increases, interest rates decrease, investment increase, and output increases. So this seems like a perfect plan. But we'll get to this later. It's very inflationary. A similar story happens in the case of foreign loans. The government borrows from foreign capital markets. They sell bonds abroad, and again, that's money flowing in from outside the economy, increasing the money supply, decreasing interest rates, increasing investment, increasing output, but again, very inflationary and not something that we would like in the long run. Now, this video briefly explained the link between the monetary and the real sectors, having a closer look to the effect of an increase in government spending. Now, we need to take the next step now, and the following video introduces the so-called ISLM model that integrates both the real sector and the monetary sector into a single model where you can do these policy analysis in one graph. I look forward to that.